turning to Revelation chapter 17 and beginning to read. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of those of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk." Now, as we begin reading this, the first thing we note is the seven angels and the seven bowls are mentioned. So we see the continuity between our previous material. This is not a new section so much as it is perhaps a conclusion that is coming to us by that angel who was a part of the story in the last seven bowls. But not only that, I think we have a larger conclusion beginning here in chapter 17, because we have been introduced to the seals, we've been introduced to the trumpets, and we've been introduced to the bowls, and they've gone through their cycles, and not only that, we were introduced to actually seven other personages, although I wouldn't identify the seven. If you count them, you'll find there are. As we've gone through the book of Revelation, and now we're, I think, moving into a conclusion. I think chapter 17 and 18, and actually the early part of 19, are a conclusion in the book of Revelation of the material we've discussed so far. We will be introduced into a great judgment in chapter 19. This warrior on a white horse coming to judge. And then we will be taken into some material on millennium and a new heaven and new earth. That in itself is a form of a conclusion, but it's more of a conclusion to a bigger picture than the simple judgments that we've been discussing so far. He says, "Come, I will show you the judgment." Now, we introduced you months ago to the idea that the book of Revelation is about a judgment, and in fact, we suggested to you that it was something of a trial. The court was sitting. In chapter 4 and 5, we see the great throne room scene in the book of Revelation, in which seated on the throne is the judge. And he is about to pass sentence. And that sentence begins, of course, with the seals. And we suggested that this sentence, this court, had its origin in the people of God, Israel, in Jerusalem, that city that's symbolic of the whole nation, and that Israel had been tried and, shall we say, weighed in the balance and found wanting. Or you might put it a different way. There's perhaps at least three good ways to put it. One would be that the Old Testament wife of Jehovah had failed time and time again in her faithfulness to her husband, and time again had been judged, and in fact called a harlot in the Old Testament as well as the New here, as we're reading about it now. And a time had come when finally God was going to divorce this wife. And the divorce procedures in the Bible, so to speak, for harlotry were to be stoned to death. Now you notice the last verse in chapter 16, which reads, "And great hailstones, about 100 pounds, each fell from heaven on people. And they cursed God for the plague of the hail, because of the plague was so severe." Now, I think it's interesting, the symbolism here in that verse, addressed to, as the whole book, I believe, is addressed to Jerusalem, and concluding that plague, where this city and this wife of Jehovah is being stoned to death. But not only that, in a unique situation in the Old Testament, if a harlot was a wife of a priest, there was an additional element of condemnation that's poured out on this particular act of harlotry. Do you remember what that additional element was to a wife of a priest? She was to be burned to death. And you'll notice that Jerusalem in AD 70 is stoned by the Roman catapults that we talked about, these 100-pound stones. And the walls are broken down, and the city is burned to the ground. And so that has been the background all up to this point. And we've come to the point, again, more than once, that I will show you the judgment. The judge of the universe and the judge of Israel is discussing the judgment that he has meted out upon this unfaithful one. And I also added that not only is there a divorce decree, in fact, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, you will be aware, and I've shared the verses with you, that God divorced the 10 northern tribes and said he had given her a writ of divorce and sent her away. And so she went away into the Gentile world, 10 northern tribes, never to be seen again. And so now another writ of divorce. In fact, God said he'd married sisters in the Old Testament, meaning the tribes associated with Judah and the tribes, of course, the 10 northern tribes. And one of those he had given a writ of divorce and sent her away. And now the other one he is divorcing, but not simply giving her a writ of divorce and sending her away, because this is the one that was in such a priestly. Judah controlled the temple, and the Levites in large numbers stayed in Judah as a result, as well as Benjamin. And this particular one was in this unique priestly relationship to God and received a more severe judgment in some ways. The wife of Jehovah is being given a writ of divorce, being punished for her sin. And then what's going to happen in almost a few verses? We're going to have the marriage supper of the Lamb. He's going to marry a new bride, the bride of Christ. So he's not going to be without his wife, so to speak. He's going to have an eternal bride, and that's the church. He divorces the Old Testament wife of Jehovah, judges her for sin, marries the New Testament bride of Christ. So we talked about that being a theme through the book of Revelation. The old wife, the new wife. Another theme, we called it a tale of two cities. The old Jerusalem below, the new Jerusalem from above. That theme is through the book of Revelation, but really culminates in the latter part of the book, where we see after the New Jerusalem is destroyed, burned with fire, AD 70, and then we have made clear for our benefit God's relationship with a new Jerusalem. Again, he's not without a people identified in some sense as Jerusalem, although it is the church of Jesus Christ. And we can also identify the book of Revelation as in some sense, searching for words here, a dismissal of the old covenant with the creation of the new covenant. Now, Christ created the new covenant on the night in which he was betrayed. But we have a 40-year period here, which is not unusual in the book of the Bible, of transition between these two covenants, in which the old covenant people are given opportunity to respond to the preaching of the gospel. And that 40-year period is over. Virtually exactly 40 years between the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ and the destruction of Jerusalem. And so the old covenant is now dismissed and the new covenant fully takes its place. So these three themes, and perhaps some others, I put a lot of stock in trying to understand the book of Revelation. So we have the judgment. I want to refer you actually, if I may, to Revelation 20 verse 4. And we're looking ahead just a little bit, but it uses the word judgment or judge. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Now we saw these thrones in chapter 4, where the 24 elders were seated around God himself and his throne. And they were given capacity or power to judge. This is a book of judgment, and we've been reading about that judgment all along. In fact, in chapter 6 and verse 10, those martyrs under the altar were saying, how long before you judge and avenge the blood, our blood? And they were told a little while. They weren't told a long period of time would pass. They said a little while. And indeed, a little while was all it took before the judgments began to fall on Jerusalem and their martyrdom being avenged. And so, in this verse, John records it and says, "Come, I will show you the judgment." I think this is something of a summary of everything we've read so far. Of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters. Now, the great prostitute is really an Old Testament theme for the wife of Jehovah, that one which had failed in her spiritual responsibilities to worship the one and true God only, but instead, as the Bible says time and time again, went whoring after other gods throughout the Old Testament. And God says, I'm going to show you the great judgment of the judgment of the great prostitute sitting on many waters. Now, what do the many waters refer to? Let's skip a few verses here and go to chapter 17 and verse 15. And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. So there's no question, more often than not, we're not given the interpretation of the symbols in the book of Revelation. Sometimes we are, and it's always rather helpful. But in this case, we, again, are given the interpretation of this symbol. This prostitute is sitting on many waters. And the many waters, we're told, are peoples and nations and languages. And seated on implies some, relationship to these, to the Gentile world in some sense here. And in fact, we discussed last week the possibility, at least held by some, that Babylon is Rome. And my contention is it's not. Babylon's Jerusalem. And I gave you reasons, and part of those reasons were the three things I just discussed a minute ago. That the book of Revelation is telling two cities, and Rome isn't one of the two. It's the Old Jerusalem and the New Jerusalem. Tale of two wives. Rome isn't one of those wives. It's the wife of Jehovah, the bride of Christ. Tale of two covenants. Rome's never been in covenant with God. It's the Old Testament family of God and the New Testament family of God. And although the argument that Rome can be Babylon, I think is a substantive one, and good men subscribe to it. Other good men do not, and I do not. I think it just misses the point of what the book of Revelation is about, and therefore don't find it an acceptable interpretation. My point is, we obviously can envision Rome sitting on many waters. It controls the whole Mediterranean world, and so it wouldn't be much of a stretch to see this prostitute as Rome because of that phrase. And yet I'd like to draw to your attention something in Acts chapter 2 and starting in verse 8 that also has to be considered. Acts chapter 2 and verse 8. And we read here we have, of course, the coming of the Holy Spirit in the book of Acts. And read, and how is it that we hear, each of us, in his own native language, Parthians and Medes, Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judah and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians, we hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God. My point is, there's a massive amount of peoples from all over the Mediterranean world mentioned here, as you can see. In some sense, Jerusalem sat also on many waters. That is, it had controlling influence on the Jewish people that settled throughout the Mediterranean world. Now, how many settled throughout the Mediterranean world? I want to read you a quote, it's in your notes, from the Illustrated History of the Jews, and I will begin. The Roman Hellenistic period is characterized by an increase in the number of Jews throughout the civilized world. Hundreds of thousands of Jews lived in Babylon, Syria, Cyprus, Asia Minor, Egypt. I don't know what that city or country is. The Lycian Islands, Greece, Italy. Their number grew from generation to generation by the combined effect of natural increase, migration from Palestine, and conversions to Judaism, which reached record proportions during the generation preceding the destruction of Jerusalem, or of the temple. What is this phrase here? Hundreds of thousands of Jews lived in the Mediterranean world outside of Palestine, and Jerusalem sat in authority over every one of them. You see, so my point is, yes, in some sense, this phrase, "this prostitute sitting on many waters," fits Rome, if you're thinking that way. I can't fault your thinking. But I would ask you to embrace another type of thinking, that this prostitute in Jerusalem also sat on many waters, and that hundreds of thousands of the citizens throughout the Mediterranean world were controlled from Jerusalem in their fame.
I believe Josephus wrote, when Herod Philip fell out of favor with Herod, the Jews in Babylon welcomed him to the courts there, and the king in that area welcomed him to the courts, and he stayed there for a while.
Well, Babylon, you mean the old Babylon?
The actual Babylon.
Yeah. There was a massive amount of Jews in Iraq. Simply because, remember, it was Nebuchadnezzar who took the whole nation to Iraq. And only small amounts of people actually came back in the 5th century BC. The great mass of people, we think, all of Israel packed its bags and came back to Jerusalem. That's not true. Only a very few came back to Jerusalem. The great majority stayed in Babylon, Iran, because they spread out, especially when the Medo-Persian Empire took over and transported the headquarters, the capital, to Iran. Even Daniel went to Iran, and some of his prophecies and dreams came while he was living in Iran. And to this day, so I've read in a book, there is a tomb in Iran of where Daniel was buried. I don't hear anything about it in recent years, but an old book of Daniel that I was studying actually showed a picture, drawings of it. So Daniel died and was buried in Iran. Massive amount of Jews, the point is, lived in Iraq and Iran many years after the return. And so Jews were everywhere. They were to the east, they were to the west, they were everywhere. And this Jerusalem, this prostitute, exercised authority everywhere. When the high priest spoke, everybody listened. Used to be a commercial years ago about a brokerage firm. How did that one go? Brokerage firm no longer exists, so I guess nobody's...
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
What was the...
W.E.
Yeah, when W.E. Hutton speaks, everybody listens. Right? Well, nobody's listening. They're out of business. So. But when Jerusalem spoke and his high priest, everybody listened. Hundreds of thousands of Jews throughout the Mediterranean world and such like. Jerusalem sat on many waters. You see my point? Now going back to our passage in Revelation. With whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality. Now, in what sense did the kings of the earth commit sexual immorality? Well, the kings of the earth were in the religion business in that era. They had separation of church and state. They had the opposite. The Roman Empire, for instance, had to approve the religions of the empire. If you didn't approve, you had the legal religions and you had the illegal religions. And in the early years of Christianity so deeply associated with Judaism was the legal religion. And Paul used that fact to keep him out of trouble from time to time. After the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, it became clear that Christianity was something else than Judaism and could no longer legally identify with Judaism or want to. And therefore it became an illegal religion. And as such was subject to the persecutions of the empire. But religion, shall we say, got in bed with the emperor. That's a pretty good illustration when you consider we're talking about prostitution here. Got in bed with the emperor, in a sense, needed the emperor's approval in order to exist. And, in fact, Judaism was no different. Judaism depended on and needed the backing and the support of the Roman Empire in order to exist. And in fact, when Jesus was brought to trial, the point made by the priest and such like was, if we don't kill this man, the Romans are going to come and take our position away from us. And so you see how they were in bed with Rome, depended upon Rome to exist, and were just as guilty of spiritual prostitution as anybody else in the empire. Have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. The inhabitants of the Roman Empire, they became drunk. That is, became committed to this worship, this Caesar worship in some form or another, and were turned away from God. Israel, which was supposed to be the great conservator of the truth, had really become a great dispenser of evil. Now, if you see anything in those notes that I'm not covering and you think I should cover, as I say from time to time, draw that to my attention. Sometimes I put together good material and then don't cover it. I talk about something else. And if you want to talk about that, let me know if you see anything there that would be of interest to you. Verse 3, and he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. This is Revelation chapter 13 again. In Revelation chapter 13, we had 2 beasts with 7 heads and 10 horns. One was the dragon that came out of the abyss, and the other was the beast that came out of the sea. The dragon, was Satan, and the other, of course, was the Roman Empire. And the only difference being was the number of crowns they were wearing. Here we're not told the crowns. At first you might not be aware which beast is under discussion, because there's uses the word scarlet beast. Well, that was identified as the dragon in chapter 13. But then it goes on and said, that was full of blasphemous names, and that was characterized as the beast that came up out of the sea over and over again. The word blasphemy was associated with that beast. And in fact, this is the Roman Empire that's under discussion here. Now, we read that the woman was sitting on the scarlet beast. Now, that's, I think, significant, because if you're thinking the woman is Rome, then you're having Rome sitting on Rome. You see what I'm trying to say? Now that, you say, well, that's impossible. Now I'm going to be fair with my opposition here and say there is a way that that could be true. That is, you could have spiritual Rome, the priesthood, sitting on political Rome. And that would not be foolish picture. But I don't think that is the picture here. I think you have Jerusalem supported by Rome. Jerusalem and the Jewish practice couldn't exist, as they admitted, without the support of the Rome that gave them their position, so to speak. In fact, even appointed their high priest that came from the Herods and the kings of Israel, who had no spiritual authority whatsoever to appoint the high priest, but he did. The kings of Israel, which were servants to the emperor, made those spiritual, so-called spiritual decisions and appointed the high priest, or disappointed them, removed them whenever they saw fit. That was illegal. It was illegal. They did it time and time again. However, that's how much they were wedded together, like a political and spiritual. So you see this woman sitting on the scarlet beast. Scarlet beast was full of blasphemous names. Had 7 heads and 10 horns. I'm going to identify that as Rome. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls. Now, is that a picture of anything you might recognize? About Exodus 39 and 1 through 3. Moreover, from the blue and purple and scarlet materials, they made finely woven garments for ministering in the holy place, as well as the holy garments which were for Aaron, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. He made an ephod of gold and of blue and of purple and scarlet material and fine twisted linen. Then they hammered out gold sheets and cut them into threads to be woven with the blue and purple and the scarlet material and the fine linen, the work of a skillful workman. What we have in Revelation is what we have here in Exodus. The garments of priesthood. The garments of the high priest. We're being clearly told that this woman is identified as a spiritual leader, so to speak, in Jerusalem. This whore is the priesthood and the high priest. Obviously, this should not be the case. And yet it has become the case. So much so that this evil institution, the Judaistic high priesthood, murdered the Lord of glory just 40 years earlier. And certainly they would have to be the most debased institution on the face of the globe to do such a thing. And so they did. Did you raise your hand or you got a tick? Or do I? Holding in her hand a cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. Let's see. I thought I had a verse on that out of Jeremiah. On a cup. Well, I don't see it right on.
51:7.
Say it again.
51:7.
Is it? Let me just quickly check Jeremiah. 51 and verse 7. Babylon was a golden cup in the Lord's hand, making all the earth drunken. The nations drank of her wine. Therefore the nations went mad. And so John, who is the most Old Testament-oriented writer in all of the New Testament, superseding even the author of the book of Hebrews by a long shot, constantly makes allusions to the Old Testament Jeremiah and Isaiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, and others. And he's making an allusion here. He's talking about Babylon. He knows what Jeremiah has to say about Babylon. And he's, lifting this image, this picture of this great evil institution, Babylon, who, in its day, corrupted the known world with its sin. And so he, of course, has transported that image to Jerusalem, which he feels is quite appropriate. He said, now, do you know that's quite appropriate? Remember chapter 11 and verse 8, and their dead bodies, these are those two witnesses, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city. That's an important phrase, and it's found in extra-biblical literature as well as here in the book of Revelation. That symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. If you weren't following the argument, he made it clear on the last statement there. This great city, which has a spiritual character equivalent to Sodom and Egypt, is Jerusalem. And he continues his diatribe against this evil institution, now calling it by another ugly name. So now we've had Sodom and Egypt and Babylon, and to make sure he makes his point, because they're a whore, and you didn't know better, you'd think he didn't like this, these people, the way he's talking. Holding in her hand a cup of gold, a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality, which she then shares, of course, with those to which she has authority. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. Now, this is another particularly important passage, because it could go either way, and you sort of have your choice. We know that Nero, about 64 A.D., began the neurotic persecutions of the church after the city of Rome burned down. He identified Christians as those that had done this, and then he began his persecutions and murdered tens of thousands of Christians in Rome, primarily in Rome. I'm not sure that persecution was outside the city of Rome. So, in that sense, you could read this and say, okay, that fits Rome, because Rome was a great murderer of the saints. And I'd give you credit for that. But I would like you to look at Matthew 23:35. This is particularly important. And speaking of Jerusalem, Matthew says, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of innocent Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. That's so important. This verse is not tied to Rome, it's tied to Jerusalem. And all of the persecutions and the judgments that are described in Matthew 24, which is the little apocalypse. It's the same stories in the book of Revelation. Everything mentioned in Matthew 24 is to come on this generation. And so then we see in the book of Revelation, chapter 17, this same type of verse, same type of words. Woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. This woman has done that. This woman has killed the prophets. And this woman has killed the highest of the high priests, Jesus Christ himself. And this woman, Jerusalem, that is subject to the judgment of God here in the book of Revelation. Any questions?